There is a section of the Grand Canyon that has no official name. It appears on federal maps. It has been photographed from satellites. Rangers have walked its perimeter. But in over 100 years of National Park Service records, not a single authorized archaeological survey has been conducted inside it. The Hopi people know exactly where it is. They have known for centuries, and every elder, every scholar, every community member who has been asked about it gives the same answer. We do not go there. This is not superstition. This is a boundary maintained with more consistency than any federal regulation. And when researchers finally asked why, the answer was not what anyone expected. In 1978, anthropologist Douglas Schwartz published a comprehensive survey of human occupation in the Grand Canyon. The survey was meticulous. It documented sites going back 4,000 years. Granaries cut into cliff faces, petroglyphs at elevations that required technical climbing to reach, agricultural terracing on canyon walls where no current model of pre-contact occupation would predict farming. Every time someone looked carefully at the Grand Canyon, they found more evidence of human presence than the previous investigation predicted. But in Schwartz's survey, and in every survey before and after it, there is a consistent gap. A section of the inner canyon, accessible by river, documented from above, that contains almost no recorded archaeological investigation. Not because it's inaccessible, because the researchers who planned those surveys consulted with Hopi cultural advisors as part of the federal permitting process. And the Hopi cultural advisors said the same thing they have always said. That area is not for investigation. The federal permitting system, which requires tribal consultation for archaeological work inside the canyon, recorded the objection and moved the survey boundary. Every time. The Hopi do not describe the Grand Canyon as wilderness. They describe it as a landscape with a structure, a maintained, mapped, intentionally organized territory that their ancestors navigated according to rules that have been transmitted through generations with extraordinary precision. Most of that structure is documented. The Sipapu, the emergence point where Hopi ancestors entered this world from the world below, is a physical location at the confluence of the Little Colorado and Colorado rivers. Hopi oral tradition identifies it with geographical specificity that has remained consistent across centuries. That part of the tradition is public. What is not public, what Hopi scholars in academic contexts have described carefully and partially, is the classification system the tradition uses for different areas of the canyon. There are places that are ceremonially active, places that are historically significant, places that are neutral. And then there is a fourth category. The Hopi word for it does not translate cleanly into English. The closest approximation that has appeared in academic literature is something like where the boundary becomes uncertain. Not dangerous in the conventional sense, not haunted in the Western sense. Something more specific than either. A place where the rules that govern ordinary human movement do not apply in the same way. Where the ancestors designated that no living person should establish a presence. Not because of what might happen to them, because of what their presence might disturb. I want to stop here for a moment, because what I just described, a physical location inside a federally managed landscape, identified by an indigenous tradition with centuries of geographical precision, consistently excluded from official investigation, that is not an isolated case. I've documented 11 other locations across the American Southwest where the same pattern appears. Different nations, different traditions, same result. A gap in the official record that clusters around exactly the places the tradition says should not be entered. The document is in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Because what the physical record inside that canyon actually shows is the part that changes the question entirely. Here is what we know from the surveys that have been conducted. In the areas of the Grand Canyon that have been investigated, the accessible sections, the rim, the established trail corridors, archaeologists have consistently found evidence of organized, deliberate human activity reaching further back and operating at greater scale than any previous survey predicted. The National Park Service's own site inventory, which is publicly available, documents over 4,000 archaeological sites in the canyon. It also documents something else. The inventory notes consistently that continued survey work reveals new sites in areas previously considered examined. In other words, every time someone looks, they find something. And in the area adjacent to the Hopi restricted zone, the section that has not been formally surveyed, there is physical evidence that has been documented from above, from the river, and from the canyon rim by researchers who were not permitted to approach closer. Petroglyphs on canyon walls at specific elevations. Horizontal markings that follow lines inconsistent with natural erosion patterns. Formations that multiple independent observers have noted in field reports as appearing deliberately placed. None of these observations have been formally investigated. Not because the evidence is inaccessible, because the tribal consultation requirement that governs archaeological permits in the canyon consistently produces the same result when this specific area is proposed for survey. The Hopi advisors say no, and the federal system correctly and legally honors that. What that means in practice is this: there is physical evidence of deliberate human activity in a specific area of the Grand Canyon. That evidence has been observed, but not analyzed. The tradition of the people with the longest continuous connection to that landscape says the area should not be disturbed. And the official record has a gap that corresponds precisely to where the evidence is. That gap is not an accident. It is the shape of a boundary, held for centuries before the federal system existed to enforce it. Here is what the pattern looks like when you step back from it. The Hopi tradition identifies a specific area of the Grand Canyon as a place that should not be entered or disturbed. The federal survey system, through the tribal consultation requirement, has consistently honored that designation. Not because it investigated and found nothing, but because it did not investigate. Physical evidence of deliberate pre-contact activity exists in the area adjacent to the restricted zone, documented from a distance by multiple independent observers, unanalyzed in any formal published study. The area remains outside the scope of active archaeological investigation. Now, there are two ways to read this pattern. The first reading is institutional. The tribal consultation requirement works as intended. Indigenous sacred sites are protected from intrusive investigation. The unanalyzed observations are in a research backlog that affects hundreds of similar low-priority filings across the canyon system. This reading is entirely possible. The second reading is different. The Hopi tradition maintained a specific prohibition about a specific location for centuries before any federal system existed to honor it. The tradition's reason for that prohibition, that the location marks a boundary where ordinary human rules do not apply, has never been formally investigated. The physical evidence that something deliberate was done at that location exists in field reports and has not been examined in any published analysis. What the Hopi elders were protecting may not have been a secret. It may have been a warning. Left in stone. By people who understood that whoever came next would need it. The Grand Canyon is 277 miles long, over a mile deep. Less than 10% of it has been archaeologically surveyed in any systematic way. In the areas that have been surveyed, researchers have consistently found more evidence of human presence, more complexity, more organization, more deliberate structure than previous investigations predicted. The assumption about what the canyon contains has not changed, even as the evidence has consistently expanded it. The Hopi boundary is still there. The field observations are still unanalyzed. The markings on the canyon wall at that specific elevation are still there, visible to anyone with the right permits and enough rope. The Hopi elders who maintain the prohibition are not protecting a story. They are maintaining a designation made by people who understood this landscape at a level of detail that no federal survey has yet reached. What they designated as a boundary may be the most precisely located piece of information in the entire canyon. We just haven't decided to read it yet. Some things are worth sitting with longer than the news cycle allows. This one has been sitting for centuries. Stay curious, stay skeptical, stay informed.